We want to talk about stagflation today, and because it's in the headlines. And you and I have touched on stagflation. The economic environment that we're in right now is causing concern that we are headed towards stagflation among some. Let's just talk about what that is and what the impacts of that might be.
Yeah, look, it's rare, right? It's one of those phenomenons where you basically have a slowdown in economic growth. We're kind of there already. Economic growth is basically half of what it was last year in the first half of this year. And economic growth could even turn negative. The unemployment rate rises. Well, we're not quite there yet, but we will be. And economic activity contracts, right? At the same time, you have persistent inflation. Prices continue to rise across the economy. And so people say, well, hold on a second. How could prices rise when at the same time you have a slowing economy? Well, remember supply and demand from your basic economics class. An increase in demand, right? A shift in the demand curve to the right raises the price level. And then, you could also get a price increase when you shift the supply stuff to the left.
To the left.
Right? If you
basically what's happening is you're creating a gap between those two points.
Well, if you basically have less supply but a bunch of demand, exactly, you get the gap between real GDP and nominal GDP. You get price inflation is the difference.
Let's just pause for a second and talk about gross domestic product, because stagflation versus a recession. It seems like these big heavy terms come dropping in every so often, and I don't know if it's just economists trying to make headlines, but there was recession talk ahead of the tariff implementations, right? Now we're talking about stagflation. A recession would be negative GDP growth over 2 quarters, correct?
Yeah, it's not just that. It's a contracting economic activity. It's an increase in the unemployment rate. It's really determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Traditionally we just looked at GDP growth, but it's more than that. It's more than negative GDP growth. And we know why, because we've seen it in the past play itself out in the past first quarter of each year now, like with the tariffs, imports, trades issues, right? But ultimately, that's it. And when we have stagflation, it's worse. It's even worse because usually in a recession, you get a decline in aggregate demand. And so you can easily the Fed can easily stimulate demand. Fiscal policy can easily, you know how we stimulate demand? You give a bunch of money and put money in people's hands. And what do? They go out and spend. You cut interest rates. You send checks to people, to families. They go out and spend. You stimulate demand.
Right. And we have experienced stimulus in the not so distant past between 2020 and when was the last stimulus? 2022?
It's very easy to get people out, to get people to go out and spend.
So the average American understands the stimulus part of it. I get a check or I get some sort of whatever.
Or I get a bunch of 0% credit cards in the mail, right?
Right. Yes.
And I go and spend, right? Very easy to do that. What happens in stagflationary scenarios is because prices are rising rapidly, right? Because you don't have a lot of supply, you can't stimulate demand. Because if I stimulate demand, I push inflation higher. I put more pressure on the price level. And so what do you do? The Fed can't cut interest rates in that situation because it will stimulate demand, right? And what you need to get producers to produce more stuff. You need to increase the economic potential, right? How do we do that? We do that by increasing the number of workers in the workforce, right? For example, right? If you have more workers in the workforce, well, and you have more jobs, you can go ahead and build more widgets and the price of widgets goes down, right? Or at least increases at a much slower pace. And I took the example of my landscaper shows up today. He's like, look, I got plenty of capital. I can buy a bunch of new trucks. I can expand.
He has labor issues.
He's got labor issues, right? He's got major labor issues. And, and that's the problem. Our nation is getting older.
Mm-hmm.
We have a 4.2% unemployment rate. We need more labor. We need, right? And we need an increase in labor supply in order to meet demand where it's at.
And 4%, I mean, for the benefit of the people that are, that are listening at home and don't track statistics, we would consider that pretty close to full employment, right? 4% unemployment.
It's very low.
Yeah.
Historically, 4.2% unemployment rate is very low. And it's very low because we just don't have, well, right now the labor market's frozen. Hiring is frozen. But at the same time, a lot of the downward pressure on wages we got in the last couple years, right? The reason inflation's been able to come down is because we had a big increase in labor supply, right? But if you take away these workers, if your population shrinks, right, or your young worker population shrinks, you end up with the unemployment rate won't rise a lot, but you're basically in an economic stagnation, right? And we don't want to go there, but it seems we're heading there, right? Where it seems everything's kind of frozen right now, and yet prices are rising, and we're getting closer and closer to 3%. We are above 3%, I think, core inflation.
I think it's 3.1.
Right? I think we're moving towards a 2% target. Now we're above 3% again. That's the fear. That's the problem. And the Fed doesn't have a lot of tools to handle this situation. They just don't. I think we need to turn to Congress. We need to turn to the president, the federal government in Washington, D.C. to start to think about how fiscal policy and how different government policies can help address this issue, right? And I love that a lot of localities are starting to deregulate housing so we can actually get more housing built and stuff like that. Because if you lower the cost for builders, maybe you get a little bit more output, right? But, if you got a population problem, that's a recipe for disaster.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts as always. It's a complex issue, and I think it's one of those terms that gets bantied about. And stagflation has absolutely been in the headlines, so I'm glad we had a chance to talk about it.